So then we have this thing, and this history still matters because this is probably still in many ways the default position of people who are trained in the bureaucracy of foreign policy around most people in the Democratic Party. I mean, this is an example of how you could see today, even under Trump, you will actually see people, in one breath, rightfully saying that Donald Trump is this hideous monster and he's a racist and all the rest, which he absolutely is across the board, but then actually saying like, oh, but we might need to team up with him to support a coup in Venezuela, right? Like, so this is still alive today. And one of the things that it kept it alive, obviously, and this is where we need to, keep fleshing out the Obama legacy, is, and this is very bizarre because this is a really well-known speech, which is kind of hard to find in video, which is surprising. But this is Senator Obama, State Senator Obama. This is in 2002 at an anti-Iraq war rally in Chicago. There's no question that the fact that Barack Obama got the invasion of Iraq right is what, that's why he beat Hillary Clinton. But in this speech, and this is fascinating because this is in 2002, he's a state senator representing a liberal district. And, on one hand, I guess we could, credit his incredible strategic acumen. But he is doing a frame here in imposing the invasion of Iraq, which sets up, in fact, the whole Obama administration for catastrophic, not only Libya and Syria potentially, but catastrophically escalating Afghanistan that I'd like you to talk about. Let's play this brief clip, and then I'll throw to you.
I don't oppose war in all circumstances, and when I look out over this crowd today, I know there is no shortage of patriots or patriotism. What I do oppose is a dumb war.
And it goes on to say, that's literally all that's there, but he goes on to say, what I do oppose is a rash war, and he makes a whole show of, there's supposedly smart wars and dumb wars.
It will almost...
How does that fit with what Obama did? And I guess even just that basic idea in liberal discourse is a distinction emanating out of the Bush administration between the savagery of the attack in Afghanistan versus the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, so I think what you see there, and the basic distinction between quote-unquote dumb and smart wars, which was very big amongst democratic discourse in the 2000s, and even is still there a bit today, is the assumption that the United States is going to have wars, that the United States, in the absence of the Soviet Union, is still going to have these wars in the world. So the question is, what is a good war and what is a bad war? And so the basic distinction and where this really got big was, as you were saying, between Afghanistan and Iraq. And the idea that Obama is expressing is that Afghanistan is a smart war because they gave harbor to terrorists, I have to say quote unquote terrorists. I hate the term, but I'm just using it for common sense. But they gave harbor to terrorists. They attacked the United States, and there we have a just cause to attack Afghanistan. But Iraq is a dumb war because there's no just cause. So what this suggests is that it goes back to this just war theory, and particularly a thinker named Michael Walzer, who was very popular in the 1990s, who essentially created the intellectual edifice for humanitarian intervention and what became the quote-unquote responsibility to protect, this idea adopted by the UN that internal populations were able to call on external forces in order to overthrow illegitimate government sources. So it's this basic idea between if you have a just cause for a war, then you can go, and if you don't, you can't. And again, this goes back to the fact that these aren't asked as contextual or historical questions. They're just framed as moral questions. So you essentially have the absence of the Soviet Union creates the intellectual space for American foreign policymakers to ignore very basic ideas of geopolitics in order to frame international relations as a passion play between the quote-unquote capital G good and the quote-unquote capital B bad. And this is expressed in this bifurcation between a smart war and a dumb war and a good war and a bad war. Now, what this ignores is that all war, or war of necessity, another way it's framed, is a war of necessity and a war of choice. And that actually became the most dominant framing in the foreign policy establishment. But what this ignores is that all wars are wars of necessity. Every single war that the United States has basically engaged in has been a war of choice, except maybe the War of 1812, when the British literally invaded what was part of sovereign territory of the United States. So it really obscures the fact and lays the ground for not only a militaristic foreign policy, which we've talked about enough, but also not enough, but we've talked about a lot. You always talk about it more, but basically a militaristic public culture. Right. So if people like you and I who grew up in the 90s will remember that the culture wasn't quite as militarized as it was after 9/11, right? With all of these troops everywhere, with the planes flying over football stadiums, et cetera, et cetera. So you have these deeply pernicious effects by just assuming that the United States needs to always maintain the material capacity to go to war abroad. And this is what these divisions between good and bad, between necessary and unnecessary, totally allied. The fact that there's this hyper-militarized empire that has the capacity to do whatever it wants in the world.
Yeah, and even obviously extensive propaganda outreach by the Pentagon and the CIA and Hollywood. Video games. The idea that those institutions are almost always reflected positively in modern pop culture versus even being right. Like, maybe the hidden villains or something like that, what they more accurately are in older pieces of pop culture. So
yeah, and I think it's important just to briefly emphasize it's not a mistake that in the 1990s you get a bunch of movies about World War II and a bunch of movies about the Holocaust, right? Because this is essentially the baby boom generation providing the justification for continued American empire after the Soviet collapse. So I think it's important to emphasize that it just doesn't start after 9/11, but there's basically a 10-year getting ready for what happens after 9/11 in the 1990s, basically providing the intellectual resources available, making them available for the notion that the United States is able to do whatever the hell it wants in the world.
So if we look at it, and we'll get to today in a minute or two, but if we were going to think of like 2 or 3 phases, it would be like there's the Clinton 90s, there's the search for, of course, the Cold War is over. Obviously, we're not going to just like massively draw down the military and cut defense spending and create national health care and take on the burgeoning ecological crisis, God forbid. So we need this new, and even just the kind of like weird psychological positionality. I think honestly, it sounds ridiculous, but I do think there's also the element of a lot of baby boomers who got out of Vietnam. Absolutely. And then they felt somehow emasculated and they were looking for some, their expression of some type of like toxic. I will, in this case, actually I will never use it again on the show because hate this kind of woke discourse, but actually really like toxic masculinity, this like idea that like virility will be found through, military adventurism, through some kind of broader purpose. So, but then there's also a lot of stuff in the 90s is also though about, it's that these things are terrible, but they're these little side excursions. And really what's happening is that it's all about making the world open for markets. And of course we actually know that's actually right. Its own, highly restrictive and predatory system. It's, writing the rules of global capital in a way that favors, multinational corporations at the expense of human beings and the planet and labor and so on. We know that story. That's the kind of core of the WTO and Clinton era foreign policy. Then in the Bush era, there's this weird dual track where on one hand, the part that, the Walzers and the Blairs of the world are actually emphasizing, and George W. Bush too had a lot of democracy promotion, talk, was that we're going to be, the bomber wing of everything that needs to happen, of women's rights in Afghanistan, of oppressed right. Religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq. And then, of course, on the other hand, both in terms of what's actually happening, which is just this, okay, we have one, the AUMF, one military authority, which still exists today, and we're going to go just lay waste across the globe. By the time I think it would be fair to say right by like 2005, at least, the response to 9/11 had already claimed 1 million lives at least, between Afghanistan and Iraq and the torture regime. So we have that dual track in Bush. And I just want to spell this all out because I want you to place all of it for us. And then under Obama, It's the sort of synthesis of Clinton and Bush with this emphasis on smartness, basically. And I think that
Right,
cuts
right.
through
And
drones
reason.
as well.
Right. So when Obama gets into office, he basically says that what went wrong with the Bush administration is that you essentially have a total elite foreign policy making. And his entire idea was that you're going to be able to have discussions. And if you bring the smartest people into the room and they have a free discussion, the best policies will arrive. The problem with that is that it doesn't actually address any of the fundamental assumptions that led the United States to intervene in Iraq, to have this hyper-militarized post-Cold War foreign policy. So Obama basically just accepts the indispensable nation rhetoric that which he grew up with as a Generation Xer in the 80s and 90s, right? Obama is very much a product of this post-Cold War moment and the idea that the military is able to act in favor of humanity. So Obama doesn't question that. He just questions essentially the process around which one decides to use military force. So, unsurprisingly, as everyone argued, he adopts a very neoliberal technocratic approach to the use of military force, one organized literally around process and getting people in the room. Now, eventually, he becomes disappointed with that because the military essentially hates Obama and they start doing all of these leaks, et cetera, and he eventually winds up in his second term concentrating foreign policy authority around his person in particular, which is why he doesn't intervene. He does militarize Syria and does a lot of stuff there, but he doesn't, bomb Syria in the same way that he used airstrikes in Libya. And just one thing that I want to emphasize, I think the crucial way to understand the links between liberal internationalism and sort of the Christian neoconservatism that George W. Bush promoted was this really, I'm a historian, this thing that's really embedded in American political culture, which is this millenarianism, that the United States has the right and duty to basically remake the world in its image. And it's there in the 1630 sermon where they coined the turn city on a hill. It's there in Woodrow Wilson, the liberal internationalism, which is really what Samantha Power and Barack Obama are heirs to. And it's there in the neoconservatism, particularly the Christian neoconservatism of someone like George W. Bush. So even though they had different approaches, there's a lot of fundamental cultural assumptions about the United States' role in the world that really unite a bunch of different Republican and Democratic administrations.
You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.